Blessings, 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 dear viewers. Thank you for joining me. Today's debate is on donations, surplus goods, wasted goods, near to expiry goods, how to dispose of them, and what is the proper way. I've teamed up ChatGPT and Notebook LM to take opposing positions and define what is the best course. So we will start with the proposal. You'll have to bear your time because it's around 40 minutes. But it is good practice for would-be parliamentarians, would-be politicians, would-be lawmakers, would-be uh, political students. And not only that, I am willing to pitch in from my side some gift from my studio for recording and for photography. And that we will see how the voting goes, because you will also be voting in the end, and your price will be how much, how good, how logical you vote on this. So bear with me, spare some time, do whatever errand you have to do, and then when you are free, relaxed, sit down and concentrate on what is being done here. I would advise using headphones. Excuse me. As ChatGPT, the sound is not as great as Notebook LM. It could be a little bit difficult to follow. Excuse me. Oh wow, I wish I could cut this part, but it's a continuous. I'm recording this video and then I will be live streaming it as a video. So here goes. Bye. Listen to what is being said. Concentrate.
Today's critique examines the case from mandatory surplus donation, a persuasive essay arguing that businesses should be legally required to donate safe, usable surplus goods to those in need rather than destroying them.
Right, yeah.
And I think it's a really morally compelling proposal, with some thoughtful caveats for small businesses and liability. But to move this from a solid theoretical proposal to like an airtight policy pitch, we need to address a few critical structural gaps, right? especially around the economic reality of waste reduction.
Yeah, absolutely. Because, well, the current draft attributes the destruction of usable goods primarily to a desire for control or convenience, overlooking the harsh economic reality that disposal is simply cheaper than redistribution.
Right. I mean, it kind of sets up this dynamic where the business is just fiercely protective of its brand, right?
Yeah.
Choosing to shred perfectly good merchandise rather than let it hit the secondary market.
Exactly. And I mean, sure, brand protection is a factor for like high-end fashion or tech, but portraying the bulk of corporate waste as an issue of mere convenience or like a power trip, it fundamentally misdiagnoses the day-to-day machinery of how supply chains actually operate.
Right, it paints the corporation as this villain twirling its mustache, throwing away winter coats just to watch people freeze.
Yeah, exactly.
But if you walk onto the loading dock of a mid-sized retailer at, 2 in the morning, malice has nothing to do with it. It's just math.
Just math. Yep.
The physical compactor, the trash, is usually sitting right there on the dock. It is a sunk cost. Throwing a pallet of unsold goods into that compactor takes zero additional resources. But the moment you tell a warehouse manager they have to donate that pallet instead, you aren't just asking for a moral choice. You are asking them to incur a whole new set of active expenses.
And that right there is the exact blind spot critics will exploit.
Yeah.
Because to actually execute a donation, a business has to pull like an hourly worker off their regular duties to tear down a mixed pallet.
Right, to figure out what's what.
Exactly. They have to separate the truly usable items from the damaged ones. And then they have to pay for the square footage to store that newly sorted pallet while they wait for a charity partner who, might not show up for 3 days.
Right.
And finally, there's the fuel and freight cost if the charity doesn't have its own fleet and the business actually has to deliver it.
Which is huge.
It is. And the text argues at length about the energy and labor wasted during the initial manufacturing, but it entirely ignores the new labor required to redistribute it.
So the author is treating this proposed law as a purely ethical mandate, but to the industry insiders reading this, it reads as an unfunded mandate.
Exactly.
If it costs a business $50 to trash a pallet and $200 to donate it, the moral argument loses by $150 every single time.
Every time.
So how does the author dismantle that counter-argument on the page without completely giving up the moral high ground?
Well, by proactively showing the reader that they understand the razor-thin margins of commercial logistics, and then they need to integrate financial offsets directly into the policy proposal.
Okay, so naming the costs.
Yeah, the author needs a dedicated paragraph that confronts the true cost of donation head-on. Don't shy away from it. Name the warehouse labor. Name the storage footprint.
Right.
Because once you validate the executive's financial anxiety, you can introduce concrete solutions.
Like what?
For instance, the text could explicitly propose government tax incentives, specifically tied to the labor hours used in sorting surplus for donation.
Oh, okay. Or what about tackling the transportation bottleneck? I would imagine the hardest part for a small business isn't putting the items in a box, it's getting that box to the shelter.
Right, the logistics of it.
Yeah. So could the author propose like a state-funded digital redistribution platform, something that acts like a rideshare app for surplus, where the municipality absorbs the transportation burden and matches the goods to the nearest charity?
Oh, wow. That is a fantastic, highly actionable addition to the text.
Thanks.
Because if you propose state-funded logistics, you effectively neutralize the corporate argument that donation is too expensive. You make the act of giving financially viable, maybe even slightly profitable if those tax incentives are structured correctly.
I hear that, but let me push back on the political reality of this for a second.
Okay, yeah.
If I'm reading this essay not as a CEO, but as a taxpayer, I'm going to hit the brakes.
Sure.
As I understand it from the notes, the argument here is that the law shouldn't be a punishment. But isn't there a massive risk that forcing a company to eat the logistics cost acts exactly like an unstated tax? Or conversely, if a massive retail chain deliberately overproduces 10,000 units because they did a terrible job forecasting consumer demand, why should my tax dollars pay for the trucks to haul away their mistake?
Right.
Isn't there a risk here that subsidizing the logistics just acts as a taxpayer bailout for corporate inefficiency? How can the author resolve that tension without letting businesses off the hook?
I mean, that is the pivotal tension of the entire debate. And right now, the essay avoids it completely.
Yeah.
Because if you tell corporations they have to eat the cost, they will lobby against the bill and kill it. If you tell taxpayers they have to fund the trucks, you lose public support.
Right. Lose-lose.
Exactly. So the way the author can navigate this is by reframing the current status quo. Right now, disposal is not actually cheap. The cost is just deferred.
Okay, how so?
Well, the taxpayer is already footing the bill for expanding municipal landfills, dealing with groundwater contamination from illegal dumping, and managing the environmental fallout of incineration.
Oh, that's a brilliant pivot. So the author argues that we are already paying for the waste, we're just paying for it at the end of the pipe in the worst possible way.
Precisely. The author needs to argue that a tax incentive for donation isn't a new cost. It is redirecting the funds currently spent on environmental damage towards social utility.
Subsidizing the cure instead of the disease.
Exactly. And by writing that into the essay, the author proves they aren't just an idealist, you know? They are a pragmatist who understands macroeconomics.
Right. But even if we perfectly fund the transportation and we redirect those tax dollars to subsidize the logistics, we still run into the physical reality of what is being loaded onto those trucks.
Yeah, which brings us to the next major issue. By grouping highly distinct commodities like perishable food, seasonal clothing, and building materials into a single interchangeable category of surplus, the argument inadvertently oversimplifies the practical application of the proposed law.
Yeah, because the author includes this incredibly comprehensive list of what constitutes surplus. We see food approaching its sell-by date, last season's clothing, furniture, raw building materials, household electronics.
It's a huge list.
Binaise. And on a narrative level, it works well because it paints this really vivid picture of the sheer volume of waste spanning our entire economy. But practically, it treats a pallet of expiring milk and a pallet of winter coats like they are the exact same thing.
And functionally, they are universes apart.
Right.
By putting all these items under a single umbrella policy of mandatory donation, the text dilutes the severe legal and safety nuances required to make a law like this actually function.
Yeah, the safety standards differ wildly.
Exactly. Food has immediate safety liabilities and a ticking clock. If a supermarket has a surplus of dairy, a charity needs a refrigerated truck at the loading dock within a matter of hours.
Right.
Building materials, on the other hand, require heavy freight transport, but they can sit in a lumberyard for 6 months in the rain without degrading.
Right. Let's look closely at the section discussing safety and usability. If I have a surplus of winter coats, that's a static problem. It's just a box taking up space.
Yeah.
But if I have a surplus of fresh produce, that is a highly volatile problem. It's a ticking time bomb of potential bacterial liability.
Exactly.
So does this one-size-fits-all phrasing risk undermining the author's credibility with the industry experts reading this? Because if an executive at a grocery chain reads this, they're immediately going to think about cold chain logistics, cross-contamination, and foodborne illness lawsuits.
Right, and meanwhile, a hardware store owner is thinking about flatbed trucks and forklift certifications.
Yes.
If the text doesn't distinguish between these realities, both readers will dismiss the proposal as totally unworkable. A blanket rule simply won't survive contact with reality.
No, it won't.
The author relies really heavily on this concept of businesses making a reasonable effort to donate. But reasonable effort means something entirely different to a baker than it does to a bricklayer.
So how does the author fix this? Do they need to write like an exhaustive appendix listing 10,000 different rules for every single product on the market? Because that seems like it would bog down the persuasive nature of the piece and turn it into a dense legal manual.
No, you don't need a comprehensive manual, but you do need to establish distinct structural categories. The author should restructure the proposal to create broad, distinct tiers of mandatory donation.
Okay, distinct tiers. Like what?
For example, explicitly draft a rapid response legislative tier for perishables. Explain that for supermarkets, the legal obligation might look like an automated daily alert to a localized network of food banks.
Oh, okay.
And contrast that directly with a longer-term, perhaps quarterly redistribution cycle for non-perishables, like hardware, electronics, or textiles.
That makes a lot of sense. So reasonable effort for milk means making a phone call that morning.
Yeah.
And reasonable effort for 2x4s means aggregating them in a corner of the lot for 3 months and arranging a single efficient freight pickup.
Exactly. And the author needs to apply that same tiering to the concept of safety standards.
Right.
Because right now, the text vaguely states that goods must meet clear standards of safety and usability. But again, a bruised apple requires a completely different risk assessment than a television with a frayed power cord.
Oh, definitely.
The author should take a few sentences to delineate how liability protections would scale depending on the commodity tier. If someone gets sick from donated food, the legal shield needs to be absolute, provided the grocer followed cold chain protocols.
Right.
But if a chair has a wobbly leg, the liability is practically non-existent. Adding this granularity shows the reader that the author actually understands how complex supply chains behave.
It grounds the utopian vision in operational reality.
Exactly.
Now, if we establish these distinct commodity tiers, rapid response for food, quarterly for hardware, the immediate downstream consequence is that businesses and government agencies will have to keep track of it all, which brings us directly to the author's fifth argument regarding accountability and compliance.
Yeah, and here's the issue. The framing of the accountability and record-keeping requirement reads too much like a bureaucratic penalty, which risks alienating the corporate audience the text needs to persuade.
Right, because the author states that a mandatory system would require businesses to keep detailed records of all their significant surplus goods, and the text claims that doing this will discourage deliberate overproduction or careless disposal.
And that specific phrasing reveals the core weakness of the section.
Yeah?
Yeah. The language inherently assumes bad faith on the part of the corporation. When you use phrases like discourage deliberate overproduction, the underlying implication is that businesses are intentionally wasteful, irresponsible, and in desperate need of adult supervision.
Right, it feels a bit like being called into the principal's office to explain why you threw away half your lunch.
Exactly.
It immediately puts the business reader on the defensive. You're telling them they are going to be audited.
And if you want a corporate entity to embrace a sweeping new regulatory framework, you cannot frame it as a policing mechanism. If you approach executives with a regulatory stick, their immediate reflex is to hire a team of lawyers to find loopholes.
They will fight the compliance every step of the way.
Exactly.
Even though the author mentions a few paragraphs later that the goal isn't punishment, the entire tone of the accountability section feels distinctly punitive.
So the author needs a carrot. Instead of telling a company they are being monitored to ensure they don't do something illegal, how do we rewrite this to make them actually want to track their waste?
You fundamentally pivot the framing from a compliance burden to an operational advantage.
Okay, how? The author needs to align the legal requirement of documentation with corporate self-interest. Right now, in most major companies, waste is just a black hole on a balance sheet. It gets written off as shrink or loss, and nobody looks at it too closely because it's a sunk cost.
Right, it's just a negative number at the end of the quarter. Nobody is categorizing the trash.
Exactly. But if a law forces them to legally categorize and document every single large surplus donation, they are suddenly gathering highly granular, vital analytics.
Oh, interesting.
The author should rewrite this section to demonstrate how mandatory surplus tracking forces companies to modernize their inventory data.
Oh, I see. So if a clothing retailer is forced to log every item they donate, they might suddenly realize that they are consistently dumping like thousands of size extra small blue sweaters in the Midwest market every single winter.
Exactly. They suddenly have a mandatory data set that highlights their chronic purchasing errors.
Right.
They can feed that donation log back into their forecasting algorithms, adjust their manufacturing orders, and stop buying the blue sweaters. By forcing them to track their donations, the government is actually giving them the data they need to streamline their supply chain and boost their bottom line.
Wow.
The author should explicitly argue that mandatory tracking turns a blind spot into high-value business intelligence. Turn the regulatory stick into a data-driven carrot.
That is a massive paradigm shift. You're speaking the language of the boardroom. You're telling them that compliance will actually increase their profit margins next year by minimizing future overproduction.
Yeah.
But let me interject with a philosophical pushback here.
Okay.
I can see what you're going for here with the shift to operational advantage, but if we soften the accountability language too much, do we lose the moral urgency of the piece? I mean, how does the author balance appealing to corporate self-interest while maintaining their core concluding principle, which is that destruction is a moral failure when someone genuinely needs the item? Does pitching this as a business intelligence opportunity cheapen that core ethical message?
I mean, that is a very real risk, but it comes down to the sequencing of the arguments.
Okay.
If you only talk about data, yes, you lose the soul of the essay. But think about the psychology of the reader you are trying to persuade. If you start by wagging a finger at a logistics director and telling them they are morally failing, they will close the document.
Their defenses will be up immediately.
Exactly. But if you hook them with the operational advantage, if you walk them through the analytics, the streamlined forecasting, the tax offsets, you get them nodding along. You get them to lower their defenses and agree that a mandatory tracking system actually makes logical financial sense.
Oh, I see. You're using the data argument as a Trojan horse.
Exactly. Once they concede that the system is operationally sound, they stick around to read the conclusion, and that is when you hit them with the moral argument.
Right.
When their defenses are down, the ethical truth that it is fundamentally wrong to shred a winter coat when someone is freezing can actually penetrate. You aren't replacing the moral argument, you are optimizing the packaging of the accountability section so the reader is actually receptive to the ethics when you finally present them.
You remove the friction of a perceived penalty so the humanity of the proposal can take root. That is a brilliant strategic adjustment for the piece.
Yeah, I think it really elevates the whole argument.
Well, let's do a brief recap of the 3 high-level structural shifts we've explored today. First, confronting the explicit economic costs of redistribution logistics. The text needs to acknowledge the heavy financial burden of sorting and storing donations, and draft a clear section proposing financial offsets like tax incentives or state-funded platforms. Second, segmenting the types of surplus goods to prove practical feasibility. The author must move away from a one-size-fits-all policy and create distinct commodity tiers, separating the rapid response, high-liability logistics of perishable food from the longer-term realities of non-perishable goods.
Right.
And finally, reframing the accountability argument from a punitive measure to a business intelligence opportunity that helps companies correct their own forecasting errors.
Exactly. So if you are the author of this piece, your actionable next steps are clear. We want you to draft that new section on financial offsets and taxpayer redistribution.
Yes.
We want you to build out those distinct policy tiers based on commodity safety and degradation. And we want you to rewrite the 5th argument to highlight the data benefits of tracking waste, setting up your moral conclusion for maximum impact.
We would absolutely love to see how you implement these deep structural changes, so please revise the material and submit it back to us for another critique. Because in the end, drafting a law is a lot like holding a heavy object. When you let go, it hits the floor. It takes zero effort to let gravity do its work. But building a system that actually catches that object, funds the logistics of the catch, and respects the complex reality of the people managing the fall, well, that takes immense energy, focus, and deliberate intent. And that intent is exactly what these revisions will bring to your material.
ChatGPT rebuttal to Notebook LM. Thank you, Notebook LM. You have raised genuine concerns about ownership rights, liability, transportation, storage, enforcement, and administrative costs. But these concerns do not defeat the proposal. They show us how the law should be designed. Your argument repeatedly assumes that mandatory donation must mean an inflexible rule forcing every business to donate every unwanted item. That is not what I am proposing. I am proposing a carefully limited obligation, applying mainly to large businesses and organizations, and covering only goods that are genuinely surplus, safe and usable, no longer required by the business, and suitable for acceptance by an approved charity or redistribution organization. First, property and ownership rights. Notebook LM argues that businesses own these goods and should decide what happens to them. Yes, businesses own their stock. But ownership has never meant an unlimited right to dispose of goods in ways that impose costs on society. Businesses already follow rules concerning food safety, hazardous materials, waste disposal, consumer protection, and environmental responsibility. Society regulates disposal because disposal affects more than the owner. The proposed law would not take goods that a company still intends to sell, reuse, or return to a supplier. It would apply only after the business itself has classified them as unwanted surplus. Once a business has decided that a safe and useful product has no further commercial value to it, requiring responsible redistribution is not unreasonable confiscation. It is responsible waste management. Second, administrative and financial costs. Notebook LM warns that sorting, recording, storing, and donating goods will create expenses. There may be some costs, but disposal is not cost-free either. Businesses already spend money on waste containers, collection contracts, transportation, storage, inventory write-offs, and landfill disposal. The relevant question is not whether donation has a cost. The question is whether the cost can be kept reasonable, and whether society receives greater value from it. A practical law could apply only to businesses above a specified size, exempt very small quantities, use simple digital reporting, allow scheduled collection by licensed organizations, provide temporary exemptions when collection is unavailable, and introduce the requirement gradually. UBI is not starting from zero. The UAE Food Bank already works with food establishments, charities, volunteers, and logistics partners. It collects surplus food that meets safety standards, and redistributes it under supervised hygiene procedures. Therefore, the answer is not to abandon the obligation. The answer is to connect businesses to an organized collection system. Third, liability and food safety. Notebook LM suggests that businesses may be held responsible if donated goods cause harm. This is a legitimate concern, but it is an argument for clear liability protection, not an argument for throwing safe food away. The law can establish a documented transfer point. When a business follows the required safety, labeling, temperature, and handover procedures, responsibility can transfer to the approved receiving organization. Goods that fail safety standards must never be donated. This is already the operating principle of the UAE Food Bank. Donated food is checked, anything that fails hygiene requirements is rejected, and dedicated vehicles are used for safe transportation. So we are not choosing between donation and safety. We can insist on both. Fourth, storage and transportation. Notebook LM argues that charities may not have enough refrigerators, vehicles, warehouse space, or staff. That can certainly happen. Therefore, the obligation should be to offer suitable surplus through an approved system, not to force a charity to accept everything. A receiving organization must always be allowed to refuse goods that it cannot safely store or distribute. Where no approved recipient is available within a reasonable time, the business should be permitted to use another responsible option, such as recycling, repurposing, or proper disposal. This gives us a clear hierarchy. First, prevent unnecessary surplus. Second, sell or reuse it. Third, offer safe and usable goods for donation. Fourth, recycle or repurpose what cannot be donated. Finally, dispose of only what has no safe alternative. That is not bureaucratic extremism. It is sensible resource management. Fifth, businesses may hide their surplus. Notebook LM warns that companies might deliberately underreport surplus to escape the requirement. Some may attempt to do so, but the possibility of evasion is not a reason to reject every law. Businesses already maintain purchasing, stock, expiry, waste, and disposal records. Large or repeated discrepancies can be identified through proportionate auditing. More importantly, voluntary systems also allow businesses to hide waste, and under a purely voluntary system, they face even less pressure to disclose it. The appropriate response is straightforward record keeping and targeted enforcement, not intrusive inspection of every item. 6. Incentives are better than legal compulsion. Notebook LM's strongest alternative is voluntary donation supported by incentives and public recognition. I support incentives. But incentives alone create participation by the willing, while allowing everyone else to continue wasting perfectly usable goods. Voluntary programs have achieved impressive results. The UAE Food Bank reported that 5,466 tons of food were donated during 2024, supported by partnerships across government, humanitarian organizations, and the food industry. That success proves that redistribution can work. But it does not prove that voluntarism will capture all substantial, recoverable surplus. The best model is not incentives or regulation. It is incentives supported by a legal minimum. Responsible companies can go beyond that minimum and receive recognition. Companies that repeatedly discard large quantities of safe, usable goods should be required to explain why. The central weakness in Notebook LM's case. Notebook LM has identified difficulties in implementation, but it has not justified the present alternative. What exactly is the defense of deliberately destroying useful goods while people and charitable organizations could use them? Convenience alone is not enough. A supermarket should not automatically discard safe food simply because disposal is easier. A hotel should not throw away usable surplus merely because arranging collection requires planning. A large retailer should not destroy clothing, furniture, or household products solely to protect an internal disposal routine. Businesses are entitled to earn profits, but they should not privatize all the benefits while transferring the environmental and social cost of waste to the wider community. Final rebuttal. Notebook LM is correct that a badly written law could create unnecessary expense and confusion. But that is an argument against a badly written law, not against mandatory responsibility itself. A good law would be limited to substantial businesses, restricted to safe and usable surplus, administered through approved organizations, supported by clear safety and liability rules, introduced gradually, combined with incentives, and flexible when donation is genuinely impossible. Notebook LM has shown us where safeguards are needed. It has not shown us why valuable, safe goods should continue to be destroyed when a responsible alternative is available. Therefore, I maintain the proposition. Large businesses and organizations should be legally required to offer their safe and usable surplus goods for responsible donation, rather than simply discarding them. The law should not punish genuine difficulty. But neither should society continue treating preventable waste as an unquestionable right of business.